Hi. So, my 8th grade biology class basically sucked. You would think it might be possible to interest a bunch of hormone-racked adolescents in a subject like, I don't know, the human body? No. I only remember 2 things from that class. One was that we dared Aaron Middleman to swallow a pythed frog and his breath smelled like formaldehyde for a week. And the other was this obsolete formula coined by one Ernst Haeckel that had been debunked like 100 years earlier, but was still being taught as if it were cutting-edge science. Ontogenesis recapitulates phylogenesis. Translated into the language of normal human beings, this means that the stages in the growth of a single embryo resemble the stages in the evolution of that embryo's species over millions of years, such that, for instance, at a certain point during gestation, a human fetus develops what look very much like gills around the neck. And that's because, claims Hegel, according to Darwin, our ancestors of eons and eons ago were fish. Hegel's theory is wrong, but it's pretty. So rather than discard it, I thought we might make use of it today for an alternate purpose, namely, to try and find a way out of the seemingly intractable conflict between progressivism on the one side and conservatism on the other, a conflict that is currently, with no exaggeration, ripping our world apart, whether we're talking about Trump supporters versus Trump antagonists, the Western versus the Muslim world, the European Union versus Brexit, or Orthodox Jews versus liberal or secular Jews. Are we really condemned to live forever on the gory battlefield between these two extremes? To suffer endlessly the miserable effects of this obstinate dichotomy between forward-looking and backward-looking ideologies? Do we really have to choose between one camp and the other? Well, in an attempt to answer that question, let me proffer for your consideration a slightly altered version of Haeckel's pseudoscientific formula, to wit, that the progress of a species in macrocosm is parallel to the life cycle of its particular members in microcosm. Or in other words, in the case of Homo sapiens, that humankind as a whole moves forward in history in a manner analogous to the growth of the individual human being over his or her lifetime. Now, in this sense, just as each one of us goes through, let's say, 3 main stages during the process of maturation, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, so too does civilization at large. Anyway, let's accept the validity of this comparison for the sake of argument. On this model, mankind may be said to have spent the majority of its historic career in a state of childhood, a prolonged epoch of innocence, security, mystery, and fantasy, and also of regulation, supervision, and subordination. For millennia, we accepted a great deal on faith, and were content to be guided by the time-honored codes of our predecessors. The rise of modernity, commencing, let's say, with the French philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century and culminating with Bob Dylan in the 1960s, constituted humanity's teenage rebellion, in the course of which the uncompromising rationalism and ruthless passion for justice of the nouveau adolescent went about slaughtering sacred cows, exposing baseless fairy tales, eradicating logically indefensible customs, and in general, throwing off the chains of the past. Notions of authority were cast to the ground in the fierce struggle for independence, and the need for law and tutelage, precedent and decorum, in short, almost everything parents try to instill during childhood, was disdained by youth's proverbial conceit. I remember myself. My dad was this big, important doctor, and my family was always being invited to these formal dinner parties at the Society of Pediatric, Osteopathic, Hematological, whatever the hell. My mother would send the 13-year-old version of me to my room to get ready for the party, and this was the moment I had been waiting for. My golden opportunity to show up my parents for the irrational, superficial, old-fashioned fools I had recently discovered them to be. I lost no time in putting on a pair of jeans that were so ripped in so many places that there was easily more leg than dungaree. And back then, I hasten to add, those holes were the products of genuine arduous wear and tear. We didn't buy the pants already distressed or destroyed like you lazy, pathetic throwbacks. I topped that off with a violently stained Grateful Dead t-shirt that I hadn't washed for a year and proceeded down the hall to make my grand entrance. I'm ready for the party. My mom would essentially faint dead away, and my dad would start in with, "Your attire is completely inappropriate for the occasion, and the clothes make the man," and more of the same. And that, of course, was my cue. You know, I really feel sorry for you, Dad. You hold on to all of these antiquated ideas that have no logical basis to speak of. It's sad. I mean, give me one good reason why it should matter what a person wears. Are you saying that we should judge a book by its cover, Dad? If you wear a suit and tie, does that make you a better human being? Seriously, give me one good reason why I should change my clothes. Come on, just one. Come on, Dad. You can't, can you? Can you? That's the indomitable, relentless, merciless logic of the teenager talking. And my parents were mortified, and they used to pretend I was somebody else's kid. Anyway, this is what modernism, with the best of intentions and motivations, did to humankind's hallowed traditions. It ripped them up by the roots and tossed them out of the garden because they could boast no satisfactory explanation, because they were deemed unscientific, irrational, or even immoral and unjust. Both of these phases, childhood and youth, are of course essential to growth. But there is a third and final stage in human development, adulthood. What characterizes this phase? Well, for one, adults begin to figure out that rationalism is not the be-all and end-all, and that, in fact, a whole slew of the things that make life worth living in the first place are specifically and fiercely irrational, like, love. Adults therefore tend to moderate the iconoclastic enthusiasm of their teenage period, and they start to look back with increasing fondness on the warmth and wonder of their tender years, a perception which grows exponentially stronger with the advent of parenthood. A new appreciation dawns for all that was simple and ingenuous, for precedent and etiquette, for magic and awe. Suddenly, the silly, romantic, inscrutable customs of our parents and grandparents regain a lot of their charm. Not everything we discover has to make logical sense to be valuable. At the same time, however, that the adult revives respect for many of the mores of childhood, she or he is justifiably unwilling to forfeit the all-important liberty and enlightenment that was acquired during the interim phase, during the teenage years. And so mature members of our species eventually come around to the realization of realizations. That in order to create the full human being, in order, as it were, to fulfill our teleological destiny and forge a true grown-up, a finessed amalgamation of teenage and childhood values is what's required. Adulthood, in other words, is an exercise in ambiguity, a constant, agonized effort to balance the demands of one's immediate past with the demands of one's distant past. In other words, check it out. True progress entails more than a modicum of regress. Well, let me repeat that. true progress requires more than a modicum of regress. And so it is with humanity in the present era. We've come to the realization, or at least we should come to the realization, that the unrestrained faculty of reason let loose by modernity on our faiths, on our families, and on our mores, with all the undeniable improvements that it brought in its wake, has also wreaked inordinate havoc on these precious institutions. And that the rationalist radicalism that came on the heels of the Renaissance, necessary and productive though it unquestionably was, must now be reined in, must be tempered and seasoned through admixture with the norms and narratives of classical times. This, then, is humanity's current imperative: to arrange and maintain the stormy marriage between modernity on the one hand and tradition on the other, to combine the adolescent with the child in order to produce the adult. Are we doing this? Some of us are. But most of the Western world is kind of stuck in the teenage phase. A couple of years ago, there was this big brouhaha at an American university, which will remain nameless, because the professor of a, not surprisingly, popular course on human sexuality decided to invite a pair of professionals to strip down to their birthday suits and demonstrate various coital positions on the stage in front of the entire class. A major hue and cry ensued in the media, and the president of the university, a professor himself, of course, and a Jew, I might add, subsequently granted interviews to several major networks in which he evinced his dismay, in so many words, at the primitive, backwards, reactionary, unenlightened attitude of the university's critics. After all, he explained condescendingly, it's just the human body. Why should we be ashamed of it? What rational reason is there for not exposing our students to something so natural? Sorry, condescension is for some inexplicable reason associated in my American mind with a British accent. And I was watching this, and I was like, all right, professor, strip. Go ahead, take it all off, right there in front of the camera. Let it all hang out. You can keep your hat on. The guy is a teenager. This professor, this president of a major university, this cream of our intellectual crop is employing the raw, right-angle, untempered logic of a 13-year-old. That's pretty sad. No less sad than those who are, at the other extreme, stuck in humanity's childhood and, for instance, are all scared and repressed and ignorant about their bodies and their sexuality. So let's not be knee-jerk conservatives, and let's not be knee-jerk progressives. Let's engage in the highly challenging, but no less highly rewarding task of combining aspects of the two tendencies, of allowing the thesis of tradition and the antithesis of modernity to fight it out inside us in a never-ending battle. Because, pace Fukuyama, history is not at an end, and there will always be more new things that we will have to balance with the old things. What are the proper proportions of this balance? Each one of us has to figure that out for themselves. But if our analogy between the way individuals grow and the way humanity as a whole progresses is useful at all, then it should forewarn us against stagnating in the past on the one hand, but it should also make us aware on the other hand that every genuine move forward entails a certain amount of doubling back. If we were all to adopt this principle, it would help moderate extreme positions and bring us close enough to actually engage in fruitful dialogue, as opposed to what we have now, both in the general and in the Jewish world, which is polarization so severe that there's virtually nothing to say and nobody to listen on the other side if you said it. So let's be conservative progressives, and let's be progressive conservatives. Instead of making our lives easy and wrecking the world by remaining blindly and obliviously loyal to one of these two camps. In a word, let's grow up.
To stay up to date with the latest JCV content, if you're on YouTube, click subscribe below the video and the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, click the like button, and under following, click see first.